Good afternoon, welcome. I'm Digby Ricci and we continue our program of English enrichment, focusing on analysing poetry. Today I'm going to examine what is called, rather strangely perhaps, the unseen poem. This phrase is always used by teachers and lecturers, and it often makes me think of those Enid Blyton books I used to read as a little boy, in which members of the famous Five or the Secret Seven wrote in orange juice, invisible ink on scraps of paper, and their messages had to be held up to the light of a candle in order to be deciphered. But obviously, this rather odd phrase does not refer to the invisible ink of orange juice writing. Rather, it refers to the fact that at some stage during your studies, all of you, as students at either secondary or tertiary level, will be expected to analyse a poem which you have not studied previously, a poem which has not been taught to you. In that sense, a previously unseen poem. And it is very important to consider exactly how you should embark on this rather difficult process. You must not simply paraphrase. In analysis, you are not asked to say what the poem is about. That is merely subject matter. You have to examine both the what the poem is about, certainly, and the how the central ideas, the themes of the poem are expressed. And this is the difficulty. Let's talk a little then about what exactly poetry is and what we expect you to do when you are critically analysing a poem. The great Harold Bloom has defined poetry as created out of figurative language, concentrated, so that its form is both expressive and evocative. Very important, both expressive and evocative. A meaning is expressed, of course, but in a way that has all sorts of fascinating echoes and connotations for the reader. And when we analyse poetry, we are dealing with tropes, T-R-O-P-E-S, devices, figures of speech that are used to express the meaning in the most memorable and most interesting and even the most complex manner. Now, there are so many tropes that you have to explore when analysing poetry that you cannot possibly deal with all of them. So it is a good idea, when you are confronted with a poem, to look at what the dominant devices are and explore them and their effects. Remember, identification is not sufficient. You will not get brownie points or marks for saying this is a simile, this is metonymy, this is metaphor, this is synecdoche, or whatever. You have to comment on the effect of these tropes, the effect of these devices as they are used in the poem with which you are confronted. So it is a mighty challenge that you are set when you engage with the unseen poem under examination conditions. And I think it is a good idea to look at a poem in more detail to show you exactly how you deal with the nuts and bolts of critical analysis. I have chosen a celebrated local poem, a South African poem, and a very well-known one. It is also a short poem, a short but devastating poem, and it will enable us to unpack the devices and the meanings of a text in a comparatively short time. It is the poem For Don M. Band, and let's begin by reading it in full. It is a dry, white season. Dark leaves don't last. Their brief lives dry out, and with a broken heart they dive down, gently headed for the earth, not even bleeding. It is a dry, white season, brother. Only the trees know the pain as they stand still erect, dry like steel, their branches dry like wire. Indeed, it is a dry, white season, but seasons come to pass. This poem is by Mongani Wally Serote, and I think it is important to tell you a little about him. Remember though, when you're analysing an unseen poem under examination conditions, do not examine the biography of the poet unless you are asked to do so, or unless you feel that biographical information is essential to an understanding of the poem. And in some respects, it is essential to the understanding of this poem. Mongani Wally Serote was born in 1944 in Sophiatown, and he came to prominence particularly in the 60s and the 70s as an activist poet. In fact, in 1969, he was detained under the apartheid government's draconian Anti-Terrorism Act, and he was detained for 9 months, if I remember correctly, without being charged with any offence. In 1974, he embarked for America. He had a Fulbright scholarship, and he studied at Columbia. He could have returned to South Africa in 1979, but he chose not to do so and went into self-exile in Botswana, returning only in 1990 when apartheid was certainly in its death throes. He is renowned as a poet and also as a novelist. He's a very prominent literary figure in African and South African history. This poem is dedicated to another poet, writer and journalist, Don Matera, who was banned at the time this poem was written. Matera was banned from 1973 to 1982, and being banned under the apartheid regime meant that you could not attend public gatherings or address public gatherings. Your contact with other people, full stop, was limited, and you could not be published. So the poem is dedicated to a victim of apartheid injustice. Interestingly, Don Matera also spent his boyhood in Sophiatown, and in fact has written a marvellous piece about his Sophiatown experiences, which has been republished in books like that collection of Johannesburg in literature entitled Reef of Time. So, for Don M. Band, that's the dedication. This is a protest poem, a political poem, but it is a political poem which expresses its protest in highly symbolic terms. As Harold Bloom has emphasized too, a proper exploration of poetry requires not simply knowledge, but also what Bloom calls literary memory. We have to remember when we read poems and understand how certain images have been used in other poems and how the present poet plays off those particular images. Let's look at how this works in this poem. It is a dry, white season. The adjective white is often associated with purity and cleanliness. Is this true in this particular context? No, it certainly is not. The white in this opening line is not the white of snow or weddings or purity. It is a whiteness associated with death, with the skeleton. The first line gives us an image of drought. It is a dry, white season, and immediately we think of bones and of death. Dark leaves don't last. Their brief lives dry out, and with a broken heart, they dive down, gently headed for the earth. Now you will notice how cleverly the imagery there shifts us into linking nature and human beings. Dark leaves suggest perhaps autumnal leaves at first, but words like lives and broken heart immediately make us think of human beings, and bleeding as well. We don't think necessarily of leaves bleeding. So the dark leaves are obviously images of what? They are metonymies for suffering human beings. They symbolize a particular section of humanity in South Africa. Now there are certain possibilities here. Would the leaves suggest, suggest young black South Africans? I think that would be a sensible interpretation. And you will notice that Serote skillfully implies that all suffering is not simply physical suffering. He looks at emotional and psychological destruction here. Certainly the imagery suggests emotional and psychological destruction. They dive down, gently headed for the earth, not even bleeding. Their lives are destroyed, whether they are physically mistreated or not. And then the repetition like a refrain. It is a dry white season, brother. Now the use of brother is interesting there. It's an interjection addressing who? Those who support his views, those who are part of the struggle. But what about all of us? Those of us who are reading the poem. Is he not inviting us to join him in a complete rejection of a system that can destroy the dark leaves, that is actually destroying the youth of the country? I think that is the correct interpretation of the use of brother. Serote is inviting all of us to be included in his struggle against injustice. It is a dry white season, brother. Only the trees know the pain as they stand still erect, dry like steel, their branches dry like wire. Now the images in these lines, the images of the trees, are difficult because there are many possible suggestions. Is Serote suggesting that the older generation that has known suffering for so long, known oppression for so long, that the members of the older generation really understand, fully understand the suffering of injustice? They are still standing, but they have endured so much. When I teach this poem in class, students often say to me, but it's strange because the trees are described as being dry like wire and dry like steel. And the connotations, a word you must know, the connotations, the associations with steel and wire are certainly very disturbing ones. Steel suggests weaponry, the bayonet, if you like. And wire, of course, inevitably suggests barbed wire, the barbed wire that we associate with the trenches of warfare and also, of course, with concentration camps. These are very disturbing images, aren't they? But I don't think that Serote is suggesting that the trees, the suffering human beings of the older generation, are like weapons or imprisoning and pain-inflicting barbed wire. Rather, he is suggesting that dryness has been imposed upon them. Their suffering has dried them up, frozen them, so that they are like steel and barbed wire. In a sense, he is saying that the steel and barbed wire of injustice render the victims of injustice dried out and suffering, but still existing, notice, for this brilliant little poem is not an entirely despairing poem either. Only the trees know the pain as they stand still erect. They are still there, but dry like steel, their branches dry like wire. Indeed, and the indeed is powerful too. It means, well, definitely, without doubt, indeed it is a dry, white season. But seasons come to pass. It is a period of injustice and suffering in which the young feel hopelessness and despair and are destroyed psychologically and emotionally. The old endure, but their lives have been shriveled and dried up until the living resemble what? weapons, barbed wire, the inanimate. They have been, in a sense, dehumanized by suffering. But resistance remains. The oppressed still exist, and situations can change. Seasons come to pass. No drought lasts forever. So the final line of the poem, "But seasons come to pass," is an inspirational one, an exhortatory one. Be aware that one season will go. It will pass and be replaced by another. And that's the key point. The dry, white season will ultimately disappear, to be replaced by fertility and growth. Again, when I've taught this poem in lessons, I've had some ingenious students who have said, but the central metaphor doesn't altogether work because seasons recur. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, and then the whole cycle begins yet again. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. And surely Serote is not suggesting that the dry white season will naturally come again. It's an ingenious argument, but it doesn't altogether work. Serote is insisting that although this is a season, it is in a way an unnatural season, an imposed season, a dry white season. And therefore it must pass, and we must ensure that it will never recur. So this is an extremely powerful protest poem, but notice it does not express any of its protest in unsubtle slogans. It uses symbolism, symbolism relating to the natural world which is linked to humanity, the dark leaves, the dried trees, and the dry white season itself. Protest poems would be banned, of course, especially in the 1970s, when there was an upsurge of poetry, especially associated with the Soweto uprising of 1976. So you could argue that Serote is being very subtle and skillful in couching his very radical and revolutionary message in this particular form. However, I would argue that the veiled attack of this poem is very, very effective indeed. We are all very accustomed to tub-thumping rhetoric about injustice, and this poem is made all the more devastating by its subtlety. So let us read it through once more. It is a dry, white season. Dark leaves don't last. Their brief lives dry out, and with a broken heart, they dive down gently headed for the earth, not even bleeding. It is a dry, white season, brother. Only the trees know the pain as they stand still erect, dry like steel, their branches dry like wire. Indeed, it is a dry, white season, but seasons come to pass. Now, I would like the students listening to this address to place themselves in that very weird position, to imagine that they were teachers and examination setters themselves. So, if you were confronted as students by this particular poem under examination conditions, what questions would you expect to be required to answer? Firstly, there would inevitably be a question about the two adjectives, dry and white, the suggestion of infertility, of drought and blight, and the whiteness associated with bone and death here. There would inevitably be a question about the dark leaves, the link to suffering black humanity in South Africa, and perhaps a question asking you, at what point in the poem do you link the leaves, particularly with human beings? You would have to look at very loaded words like lives and broken hearts, to stress the symbolic power of the use of dark leaves. Then you could be asked about brother. Why the use of brother? And I've explored already all the suggestions of that. Speaking to those who unite with him against injustice, but also insisting that all readers should become brothers and join in the struggle. Then, of course, you could be asked, and here you're fully entitled to come up with your own interpretations, what do the trees stand for? I've suggested they stand for an older generation of suffering human beings in South Africa. And then, of course, you have to come to terms with the like steel and like wire similes. Do refer to them as similes. You must be very exact and accurate when you explore tropes in analysis of poetry. What is suggested here? That the suffering and dehumanized oppressed have lives that are shriveled and dried, lives that almost become like the steel of weapons and the wire of barbed wire. Serote is not, of course, blaming the victims in any way, but stressing how acute their suffering is. Their existences controlled by steel and barbed wire become like steel and barbed wire. You could be asked about the indeed, and then, of course, an obvious question is the poem pessimistic or optimistic? And I think you have to conclude that with its inspiring, even exhortatory final line, it is more optimistic. Seasons come to pass, but one must ensure that the unnatural season of injustice never recurs. As I trust you've noticed, when analysing this poem, I've certainly said what it is about. Apartheid, injustice, responses to it, the suffering of the oppressed. But I've also indicated exactly how Serote has communicated his aversion to injustice and his inspirational claim that one must stand against it and ensure that a dry white season does not recur. In short, I hope that I've demonstrated to you in this short lecture how you unite in your writing an awareness of the what, the subject matter of the poem, and the how, the devices that are used to explore that subject matter. For that is what successful critical analysis is all about, uniting the what and the how, and exploring the effectiveness of the tropes that are used to communicate the poet's meaning. And this would seem to be a perfect moment to conclude this short address. I hope it assists you when you are confronted with that strange creature, the unseen poem. And I hope you've enjoyed my take, and remember it is my take, on one of my all-time favorite South African poems, Serote's For Don M. Band. Thank you very much.